Lonely rancher finds woman hanging from the barn roof with Apache lover burned into the door below. The sun had barely cracked the horizon when Thomas Whitman saw the shadow against his barn, dark and still in the pale morning light. He'd been walking this same path to tend his horses for 3 years now, ever since Mary died and left him alone on 200 acres of Colorado grassland. But this morning was different. This morning, something hung from the barn roof like a broken doll. He stopped walking, his coffee cup halfway to his lips, steam rising in the cold air. The shadow swayed slightly in the wind, and his stomach dropped. It was a person, a woman, from the long hair that caught the light like spun gold. She hung motionless from a rope tied to the roof beam, her feet dangling 3 feet above the ground, her body limp against the barn wall. He dropped the cup, hot coffee splashing across his boots, and ran. His heart hammered against his ribs as he got closer and saw what was burned into the barn door below her feet. The words were seared deep into the wood, black letters that spelled out hatred in rough, angry script. Apache lover. Thomas reached her just as the wind shifted her body slightly, and he saw her face. Young, maybe 25, with dirt streaked across pale cheeks and dry blood at the corner of her mouth. Her eyes were closed, but as he watched, her chest rose and fell in a shallow, struggling breath. She was alive. He didn't think, just moved. Thomas grabbed a wooden crate from beside the barn and climbed up, pulling out his knife to cut the rope around her neck. The hemp was thick and new, tied with the kind of knots a man learns in the army. Someone had wanted this to look deliberate, permanent. But they'd made one mistake. They'd left her to die slow instead of quick. As the rope gave way, she collapsed into his arms, her weight surprising him. She was heavier than she looked, solid muscle beneath torn calico dress and mud-stained petticoat. He lifted her carefully, feeling her head loll against his shoulder, her breath warm and uneven against his neck. The house was 50 yards away, a simple cabin with 2 rooms and a stone chimney that Mary had always said made it feel like home. Thomas had barely been inside since the fever took her, preferring to sleep in the barn loft where her absence didn't echo so loud. But now he carried the stranger through the front door, into the main room where dust motes danced in the morning light, streaming through windows Mary used to keep spotless. He laid her on the old sofa, the one Mary had insisted on bringing from St. Louis when they moved west. The woman's breathing was labored, rattling in her chest like stones in a jar. Thomas knelt beside her and gently turned her head to check her injuries. A purple bruise circled her throat where the rope had bit deep, and there were other marks, finger-shaped bruises on her wrists, a cut across her bottom lip, scratches along her arms that looked like she'd been dragged through brush. Someone had hurt her bad before they'd hung her to die. Thomas had seen enough violence in his 38 years to recognize the signs. He'd served 2 years in the cavalry before he met Mary, had seen what men could do to each other when hatred got loose. But this felt different, more personal. The words burned into his barn door weren't just cruelty. They were a message, a warning meant for anyone who might find her. He fetched water from the well and clean rags from Mary's sewing basket, the same basket that still sat beside her rocking chair, like she might come back to finish the quilt she'd been working on. The woman stirred slightly as he cleaned the blood from her face, her eyelids fluttering but not opening. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words he couldn't hear. "You're safe now," Thomas said quietly, though he wasn't sure if that was true. Whoever did this might come back to finish what they started. As he worked, cleaning her wounds and checking for broken bones, Thomas found himself studying her face. She was pretty in a fierce way, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that spoke of determination. Her hair was the color of wheat at harvest time, though now it was tangled with burrs and dried leaves. Her hands were calloused from hard work, but her nails were clean and neat despite everything she'd been through. This wasn't some saloon girl or camp follower. This was a woman who'd known a different kind of life before someone decided she deserved to hang for loving the wrong man. That thought made Thomas's jaw tighten. He'd never understood that kind of hatred, the need to punish people for who they chose to love. Mary had taught him that love was rare enough in this hard world, that folks ought to celebrate it wherever they found it, not string it up like a warning to others. By midday, the woman's breathing had steadied and the worst of the bleeding had stopped. Thomas had moved her to his bedroom, the one he and Mary had shared, because it had the best light and the softest bed. He'd sat in the wooden chair beside the window, watching her sleep and wondering what he was supposed to do next. The smart thing would be to take her to town, let Doc Morrison look her over proper, and maybe get the sheriff involved. But something held him back. Maybe it was the words burned into his barn door, the clear message that someone wanted this woman dead. Maybe it was the way she'd whispered please in her sleep, the word barely audible but heavy with desperation. Or maybe it was just that the house had felt less empty since he'd carried her inside, like some of the silence had lifted. As the afternoon sun slanted through the bedroom window, painting golden squares on the wooden floor, the woman's eyes finally opened. They were green, the color of spring grass, and filled with terror so pure that it made Thomas's chest ache. She tried to sit up fast, her hands flying to her throat, but her body wasn't ready for movement. She collapsed back against the pillows with a sharp gasp, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar room like a trapped animal looking for escape. "Easy now," Thomas said, keeping his voice low and steady. "You're hurt. You need to rest." Her gaze fixed on him, taking in his weathered face and work-worn hands, the way he sat careful and still in his chair, like he was trying not to spook a wild horse. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a harsh whisper came out. "Water," she managed. Thomas poured from the pitcher beside the bed and helped her sit up enough to drink. She drank like someone who'd been thirsty for days, the water running down her chin and soaking into her torn dress. When she'd had enough, she lay back and looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to hold more pain than anyone should have to carry. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice still rough from the rope burn. "I'm Thomas Whitman. This is my ranch." He set the water glass on the side table. "I found you this morning, hanging from my barn." Something flickered in her eyes, shame maybe, or fear. She looked away, staring at the ceiling like she could find answers in the wooden beams. "You should have left me there," she said quietly. "No, ma'am, I shouldn't have." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "What's your name?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, barely audible, "Sarah. Sarah Millfield." The name hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. He'd heard it before, whispered in the town saloon and the general store, always with the kind of tone people used when they talked about scandal. Sarah Millfield, the banker's daughter who'd run off with an Apache brave 2 years ago, breaking her father's heart and shaming the whole family name. Sarah must have seen the recognition in his face because she turned away again, pulling the quilt up to her chin like she could hide from the truth. "Now you know. Now you know why they wanted me dead." If this story has you hooked, hit that subscribe button. There's so much more coming. And drop a comment below. What would you have done in Thomas's place? Would you have cut her down or kept walking? Let me know your thoughts. Thomas didn't speak for a long moment, just looked out the window at the mountains rising purple against the evening sky. Finally, he turned back to her with eyes that held no judgment, only a quiet sadness that seemed older than his years. "I know what people say about you," he said, "but I also know that hanging someone for love is about the most cowardly thing a man can do." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the first emotion she'd let show since waking up. "You don't understand. They were right to hate me. I betrayed everything I was raised to believe. I turned my back on my own people." "Did you?" Thomas asked. "Or did you just follow your heart?" "My heart led me to disaster." The words came out bitter and broken. "It led to death." Thomas waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. Sarah closed her eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper.
His name was Running Wolf. He saved my life when I was thrown from my horse during a hunting party 3 years ago, found me with a broken leg miles from anywhere, and carried me to safety instead of leaving me to die. She opened her eyes and looked at Thomas. He was supposed to be my enemy, but he treated me with more kindness than most white men ever had. Thomas nodded, understanding more than she knew. He'd served alongside Apache scouts during his cavalry days, had seen their honor and courage dismissed by men who'd never bothered to know them as people. We fell in love. I went to live with his people, learned their ways, tried to become the woman he deserved. For 2 years we were happy. We were planning to marry in the spring, to start a family. Her voice broke completely. But my father couldn't stand the shame. He hired men to find me, to bring me home. When I refused to go, when Running Wolf tried to protect me, they shot him down like a dog. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Your father ordered his death? Not directly, but he paid those men, told them to do whatever it took to bring me back to respectability. Sarah's hands clenched into fists in the quilt. They made me watch him die, then drag me from town to town like some kind of warning to other women who might think about straying from their place. When they got tired of feeding me and listening to me cry, they decided to make an example out of me. The quiet rage that filled Thomas then was different from anything he'd felt before. It wasn't the hot anger of a young man, but the cold fury of someone who'd seen too much cruelty justified by righteous words. He stood up and walked to the window, his hands clenched at his sides. "Where are they now?" he asked quietly. "Gone, I hope. They left me hanging and rode off laughing about how my Apache lover couldn't save me this time." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Why are you helping me? You could turn me in, collect whatever bounty my father's put on my head, or you could just let me go and tell people you never saw me." Thomas turned back to her, and in her eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. It wasn't pity or disgust or even sympathy. It was recognition, the look of someone who understood loss and knew that some wounds never fully heal. "My Mary died 3 years ago. Fever took her in 2 days. Nothing I could do to stop it. Before she passed, she made me promise I'd never let hatred poison my heart the way it had poisoned so many others. She said love was the only thing that made this hard world bearable, and that anyone brave enough to choose love over fear deserved protection, not punishment." Sarah stared at him, seeing past the weathered exterior to the gentle soul underneath. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was, and she would have liked you, I think, would have admired your courage." "Courage," Sarah laughed bitterly. "I let fear rule me in the end. When they came for Running Wolf, I froze. I couldn't even scream when they shot him. Some brave woman I turned out to be." "You survived," Thomas said firmly. "That took courage too. And you're still here, still breathing, still able to honor his memory. That's not nothing." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell outside, the only sound the wind sighing through the cottonwoods by the creek. Thomas had lit the oil lamp on the bedside table, and its warm glow made the room feel safe and protected from the harsh world beyond its walls. "I can't stay here," Sarah said. "Those men might come back, and I won't be responsible for bringing violence to your door." "Those men are welcome to try," Thomas said with a quiet confidence that surprised them both. "I may not be the fighter I once was, but this is my land, my home. And Mary always said home was where you protected the people who needed protecting." Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a tiny spark of hope kindling in her chest. "You don't barely know me. I know enough. I know you loved someone worth loving, and that you paid a terrible price for it. I know you're hurt and scared and probably don't trust easily anymore." Thomas met her eyes. "And I know that tomorrow morning I'm going to make breakfast and ask if you want to stay another day. After that, it's up to you." For the first time since she'd opened her eyes in this strange room, Sarah smiled. It was small and tentative like a flower pushing through snow, but it was real. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas nodded and stood to go. "Get some rest. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." As he reached the door, Sarah called his name softly. He turned back to see her watching him with something like wonder in her green eyes. Running Wolf used to say that the spirits sometimes sent people into our lives exactly when we needed them most in life. I never believed him until now. Maybe he was right. Maybe Mary's still looking out for both of us. He left her then, closing the door quietly behind him, and walked out onto the front porch to stand under a sky brilliant with stars. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas Whitman felt like he had a purpose again, something more important than just surviving each day until the next. Inside the house, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling and listening to the night sounds of a place that felt safer than anywhere she'd been since Running Wolf died. She touched the bruises on her throat and thought about the man who'd cut her down from his barn without asking her story first, who'd tended her wounds and offered protection without expecting anything in return. Maybe there was still good in the world after all. Maybe some hearts were strong enough to choose compassion over convenience, love over fear. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she had thought.
The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grass like scattered diamonds. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, scents that reminded her of mornings in her father's house before everything went wrong. She dressed carefully in the clean clothes Thomas had left for her, one of his shirts rolled up at the sleeves, and a pair of Mary's old riding pants that fit well enough. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Thomas at the stove, stirring eggs in a cast-iron pan. He looked up when she entered, taking in her appearance with a nod of approval. "You look better," he said simply. "How do you feel?" "Sore, tired, but alive." Sarah sat down at the wooden table that dominated the small kitchen. "I never thanked you properly for saving my life." "No need." Thomas divided the eggs between 2 plates and set one in front of her. "Eat. You need to get your strength back." They ate in companionable silence, both aware that decisions needed to be made, but neither wanting to rush into them. Sarah found herself studying Thomas as he ate, noting the careful way he moved, like a man who'd learned to be gentle with the world. His hands were scarred from years of ranch work, but when he tended her wounds, those same hands had been softer than silk. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said finally. Thomas nodded, sipping his coffee. "Why didn't you have children, you and Mary?" A shadow passed over his face, but he didn't look away. "We tried, lost 3 babies before they could draw breath, and after the last one, Mary couldn't carry any more. Doc said it wasn't anybody's fault, just the way things were, but Mary blamed herself until the day she died." "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked." "No, it's all right. Mary always said that maybe we were meant to love other people's children instead of our own. She taught reading to the kids in town every Sunday after church, helped any family that needed it." Thomas's voice grew soft with memory. "She would have wanted me to help you, would have insisted on it." Sarah felt her chest tighten with emotion. "She sounds like she was an angel." "She was human, made mistakes, had her stubborn moments, got angry when I tracked mud on her clean floors." Thomas smiled slightly. "But she had a heart big enough for the whole world, and she loved without conditions. That's rarer than gold in this country." After breakfast, Thomas showed Sarah around the ranch. It wasn't large by Colorado standards, just 200 acres of grassland and timber, with a small herd of cattle and horses that provided enough income to live comfortably. But it was well maintained and beautiful, nestled in a valley between rolling hills that stretched toward snow-capped mountains in the distance. "Mary wanted to plant an orchard here," Thomas said, pointing to a flat area near the house. "Apple trees, maybe some cherry. Never got around to it." Sarah looked at the empty space and could imagine it filled with blossoming trees, could almost hear children's laughter as they played beneath the branches. The image made her heart ache with longing for a future that seemed impossible now. "It would have been beautiful," she said. Thomas glanced at her, noting the wistful tone in her voice. "Still could be, I suppose, if someone wanted to plant it." They walked down to the barn where Thomas showed her the horses. He had a natural way with them, he noticed, speaking softly and moving without fear despite everything she'd been through. When a young mare nuzzled her shoulder, Sarah laughed, the first genuinely happy sound Thomas had heard from her. "Running Wolf taught me about horses," Sarah explained, stroking the mare's neck. "Said they could sense a person's true heart better than most people could." He was right about that. Thomas watched as Sarah continued to gentle the horse. "What else did he teach you?"
Everything that mattered. How to read the weather and cloud patterns, how to find food in the wilderness, how to track animals without disturbing their paths, how to see beauty in things other people thought were worthless. Sarah's voice grew soft. How to love without reservation, even when it seemed impossible. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight grip grief had held on his heart for 3 years. Sounds like a good teacher. The best. Sarah turned away from the horse and looked at Thomas directly. He would have liked you, I think. Would have respected the way you live, the kindness you show without expecting anything back. The days passed quietly after that, falling into a rhythm that felt natural despite its newness. Sarah helped with the ranch work, proving herself capable with animals and skilled the tasks that surprised Thomas. She could mend fences, milk cows, and handle a rifle better than most men he knew. But it was the small things that made the biggest impression. The way she hummed while she worked, how she always made enough coffee for 2, and the gentle way she spoke to the animals. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked about everything except the future. Thomas told her stories about his time in the cavalry, about meeting Mary and building the ranch from nothing. Sarah shared memories of her childhood, of her mother who died when she was 12, of the books she'd loved and the dreams she'd once had of seeing the world. But underneath the comfortable routine, both of them knew that their peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. The outside world had a way of intruding on even the most carefully guarded sanctuaries, and Sarah's past was the kind that didn't stay buried for long. The reminder came on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Thomas had cut Sarah down from his barn. He was repairing a section of fence when he saw the rider approaching from the east, moving fast and purposeful across the grassland. Thomas recognized the man before he was close enough to call out. Jake Morrison, the doctor's son, who sometimes carried messages between the scattered ranches. "Thomas," Jake called as he reined his horse to a stop. "Got news from town you need to hear." Sarah had been hanging laundry behind the house, but she appeared at Thomas's side when she heard voices. Jake's eyes widened when he saw her, recognition dawning on his young face. "Miss Millfield, but everyone said you were—" "Dead?" Sarah finished quietly. Almost was. Jake looked between them, confusion clear in his expression. Thomas stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What's the news, Jake?" "Men came through town yesterday, asking questions about a blonde woman, claiming she stole something from them. They're offering a reward for information leading to her capture." Jake's eyes kept darting to Sarah. $100, Thomas. That's more money than most folks see in a year." Thomas felt Sarah go very still beside him, but he kept his own expression neutral. "What kind of men?" "Hard men, the kind that don't take no for an answer. They said they'd be back in a few days to check if anyone had seen anything." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Sheriff's scared of 'em, won't even pretend to investigate their story about theft, just wants them gone as quick as possible." "I appreciate you riding out to tell us this, Jake. You want some coffee before you head back?" Jake glanced at Sarah again, and Thomas could see the war playing out on the young man's face, the temptation of easy money against his natural decency. Finally, Jake shook his head. "Better get back. Ma's expecting me." He paused, meeting Thomas's steady gaze. "I didn't see nothing out here, if anybody asks. Just a man living quiet on his own land." After Jake rode away, Thomas and Sarah stood in silence, watching until he disappeared over the ridge. The peaceful bubble that had surrounded them for 2 weeks had finally burst, and reality was flooding back in. $100, Sarah said finally. "That's enough to feed a family for months." "It's blood money," Thomas replied firmly. "And Jake Morrison is a good kid. He won't talk." "But others might. And those men—" Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, remembering the cruel laughter as they had left her to die. "They're not the type to give up easily." Thomas turned to her, seeing the fear creeping back in her green eyes, and made a decision that surprised them both with its certainty. "Then I guess we'd better get ready for them." Sarah stared at him. "Thomas, no! I can't let you risk your life for me. I'll leave tonight, head for Mexico or California, somewhere they can't follow." "And go alone? With no money, no supplies, and men hunting you?" Thomas shook his head. "That's not protection, Sarah. That's just a slower way of dying." Better than getting you killed." Thomas stepped closer, close enough that she could see the determination burning in his dark eyes. "What matters is what happened to you was wrong, and letting it go unpunished would be wrong too. And because—" he paused, as if the words were difficult to find, "because I care about you, Sarah, more than I thought I could care about anyone again." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and danger in equal measure. Sarah looked into his face and saw not just kindness, but something deeper, the beginning of love, fragile but real. "I care about you too," she said softly. "That's why I have to go." "No," Thomas's voice was gentle but implacable. "That's exactly why you have to stay, so we can face this together, the way it should be faced." Sarah searched his expression and found only steady resolve. This man who had saved her life was now offering to risk his own for her, not out of obligation or pity, but out of something that looked remarkably like love. For the first time since Running Wolf's death, Sarah felt like she had something to fight for, too.
They had 3 days to prepare, and Thomas used every hour. He cleaned and loaded every weapon on the ranch, 2 rifles, a shotgun, and his old cavalry pistol that he hadn't touched in years. He moved supplies into the root cellar behind the house and scouted defensive positions around the property. Most importantly, he rode to the neighboring ranch to speak with old Pete Garrison, a former Army sergeant who'd homesteaded the land to the west. Sarah spent the time preparing in her own way. She wrote a long letter, pouring her heart onto paper in careful script, then sealed it and gave it to Thomas. "If something happens to me," she said, "make sure this gets to the Apache reservation north of here. Ask for a man called Greyhawk. He was Running Wolf's brother. He should know what happened to me, how I honored his brother's memory at the end." Thomas took the letter without argument, though they both hoped it would never need to be delivered. On Saturday morning, they came. Sarah spotted them first, 5 riders approaching from the south, moving in a loose formation that spoke of military experience. She was hanging laundry behind the house, maintaining the pretense of normal life, but her hands shook as she pinned sheets to the line. "Thomas," she called softly. He emerged from the barn, rifle held casually at his side, and nodded when he saw the riders. "Go inside," he said quietly. "Stay away from the windows. I should fight beside you. You will, if it comes to that. But right now, I need you safe." Sarah hesitated, then squeezed his hand briefly, before disappearing into the house. Thomas walked out to meet the riders, his rifle held at ready, but not openly threatening. He stopped 20 feet from his front porch and waited. The man who rode in the lead was exactly what Thomas had expected. Tall, lean, with the kind of cold eyes that had seen too much killing and enjoyed it. His clothes were well made but travel-stained, and he wore his gun like a man who'd drawn it in anger more times than he could count. The others spread out behind him in a semicircle, hands resting on their weapons. "Morning," the leader said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Name's Wade Garrison. I'm looking for a woman, blonde, about 25. Goes by Sarah Millfield. Heard she might have been seen in these parts." Thomas kept his expression neutral. "Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description. What she wanted for?" Wade's smile was cold as winter wind. "Theft. Stole something valuable from her employers before she ran off. We're here to return her to justice." "What'd she steal?" "That's between us and her." Wade's eyes narrowed as he studied Thomas's face. "You sure you haven't seen her? Woman like that would be hard to miss." "I'm sure," Thomas said calmly. "Like I told young Morrison when he came by. I live alone out here, keep to myself mostly." One of the other riders, a man with a scar running down his left cheek, spurred his horse forward. "What about that laundry hanging behind your house? Looks like women's clothes to me." Thomas felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained steady. "Belong to my late wife. I wash them sometimes. Keeps the moths away." Wade studied him for a long moment, then dismounted and walked toward the house. "You won't mind if we take a look around then, just to be thorough." "Actually, I would mind." Thomas raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at Wade, but making his intentions clear. "This is private property,
and you've got no legal authority here that I can see." Wade stopped walking, his hand dropping to his gun. Now that's not very neighborly. Neither is threatening a man on his own land. Thomas heard the sound of a rifle being cocked behind him and knew that Pete Garrison had taken his position in the hayloft as planned. The old sergeant might be past 60, but his aim was still true. Wade heard it too and froze, his eyes flicking toward the barn. "Seems you've got friends." "I've got neighbors who don't like strangers making threats." Thomas stepped forward slightly. "Now, I've answered your questions politely. Time for you to move on." For a moment, the tension stretched tight as a bowstring. He could feel death hovering in the air like smoke, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Then Wade smiled again and stepped back. "Of course, we wouldn't want to overstay our welcome." He remounted his horse, but didn't ride away immediately. "Funny thing, though, we heard this woman had a special fondness for Apache bucks. Heard she learned all kinds of interesting skills from them. Tracking, surviving in the wilderness, handling weapons." His eyes glittered with malice. "If she was here, she might be smart enough to hide somewhere we couldn't see her. But don't worry, we're patient men. We'll be keeping an eye on this area for a while." With that threat hanging in the air, Wade and his men rode away, but Thomas noticed they didn't head back toward town. Instead, they disappeared into the timber to the north, where they could watch the ranch from concealment. Pete Garrison climbed down from the hayloft, his weathered face grim. "They'll be back," he said simply. "Tonight, most likely." Thomas nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "Can you stay?" "Already sent word to my boys. They'll be here before dark." Pete looked toward the house where Sarah had reappeared in the window. "That's the girl?" "That's her." Pete studied Sarah's face through the glass, noting the strength in her bearing despite everything she'd been through. "He looks like a fighter." "He is. Question is whether that'll be enough." That evening, as the sun painted the mountains red and gold, Thomas gathered his small army in the kitchen. Pete had brought his 2 sons, both veterans like their father, and Jake Morrison had surprised everyone by showing up just after sunset with his hunting rifle and a grim expression. "Couldn't live with myself if I didn't help," the young man said simply. "Besides, my pa taught me that some things are more important than staying safe." Sarah looked around at the faces of these men who were willing to risk everything for her and felt her throat tightened with emotion. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "I can slip away in the dark, lead them off in the wrong direction." "No," Thomas's voice was firm. "We do this together or not." Pete spread a rough map of the ranch on the table, marking positions with spent bullet casings. "They'll come from the north. Use the timber for cover until they're close. Jake, I want you in the root cellar with one of the rifles. You'll have a clear shot at anyone who tries to circle around behind the house. My boys will take the barn and the corral, catch them in a crossfire if they try to rush us direct." "Where do you want me?" Sarah asked. Pete looked at her appraisingly. "You any good with that pistol you're carrying?" Sarah's hand went instinctively to the gun belt she'd strapped on after the confrontation with Wade. It had belonged to Running Wolf, and she'd learned to use it well during their time together. "Good enough." "Then you stay in the house with Thomas, cover the windows, and make sure nobody gets inside." Pete's eyes were serious. "But understand something, girl. If this goes bad, if we can't hold them, Thomas here will try to get you out the back. When that happens, you go and don't look back. You hear me?" Sarah nodded, though they all knew she had no intention of running while these men died for her. As midnight approached, they took their positions and waited. The ranch lay quiet under a canopy of stars, but Thomas could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. He and Sarah crouched by the front windows, watching the tree line for movement. "Are you afraid?" Sarah whispered. Thomas considered the question honestly. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of failing you, of letting what happened to Running Wolf happen again." Sarah reached over and took his hand, feeling the steady strength in his calloused fingers. "You won't fail me. You've already saved me more than you know. How do you figure? Because you made me remember what it feels like to be worth protecting, to matter to someone." She squeezed his hand. "Whatever happens tonight, you've given me that. Before Thomas could respond, Pete's voice drifted softly from the barn. "Movement in the trees! Here they come!" The attack came swift and brutal, just as Pete had predicted. Wade's men burst from the timberline in a coordinated rush, firing as they came. The ranch erupted in gunfire, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness like deadly lightning. Thomas saw Wade himself making for the house and fired, his shot taking the man high in the shoulder and spinning him around. But Wade kept coming, returning fire as he dove for cover behind the water trough. "Back window!" Sarah shouted, spotting one of the attackers trying to circle around. She put 2 shots through the glass, and the man dropped with a scream. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Jake Morrison proved his worth by dropping one attacker with a single well-placed shot, while the Garrison boys kept up a steady fire from the barn that prevented Wade's men from advancing. But the defenders were outnumbered, and gradually Wade's men began to close the circle. Thomas watched helplessly as one of Pete's sons went down, clutching a bloody shoulder. The attackers pressed their advantage, moving closer to the house. That's when Sarah made her choice. "Thomas," she said quietly, reloading her pistol with steady hands, "I'm going out there." "Like hell you are. They want me, not you. If I surrender, maybe they'll let the rest of you live." Thomas grabbed her arm as she started toward the door. "Sarah, no. That's not surrendering, that's suicide." She looked at him with those green eyes that had seen too much pain, and Thomas saw that she'd already made peace with her decision. "Running Wolf died protecting me. I won't let you do the same." "Mary wouldn't want me to let you walk out there alone." Thomas stood up, decision crystallizing in his mind. "So I'm going with you." "Thomas!" "Together," he said firmly. "We do this together." Sarah stared at him for a moment, then nodded. Together. They walked out onto the front porch, side by side, weapons lowered but ready. The gunfire gradually died away as both sides realized what was happening. Wade emerged from behind the water trough, blood soaking his shirt, but his gun steady in his hand. "Smart choice," he called out. "Now kick away those guns and come down here slow." "No," Sarah said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard. "I'll come with you, but these men don't get hurt. That was never part of your deal with my father." Wade laughed harshly. "Your father's dead, girl. Died of shame 2 months ago when the whole territory learned his precious daughter was living like a savage. We're working for ourselves now." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she didn't let it show on her face. "Then what do you want?" "Justice. The kind of justice you should have gotten before you spread your legs for that Apache buck." Wade's eyes glittered with hatred and something worse. "We're going to make sure you never corrupt another white woman with your example." Thomas felt cold rage flood through him at the man's words, at the casual cruelty in his voice. These weren't lawmen seeking justice. They were killers who enjoyed their work. "That's not going to happen." Wade swung his gun toward Thomas. "You don't get a say in this, rancher." "Actually, he does." Pete Garrison's voice came from the darkness beside the barn, calm and authoritative. "Because you're surrounded." Lights suddenly blazed from positions all around the yard. Not just Pete's people, but others. Thomas recognized faces from town, men he'd barely spoken to, but who apparently decided that some things couldn't be allowed to stand. Even Doc Morrison was there, holding an old cavalry pistol with hands that shook but didn't waver. Wade looked around wildly, realizing that his hunters had become the hunted. "This isn't over," he snarled. "Yes, it is." Sheriff Hayes stepped into the light, his badge gleaming on his chest and his shotgun pointed directly at Wade. "Wade Garrison, you and your men are under arrest for attempted murder, assault, and terroristic threats." The fight went out of Wade's men like air from a punctured bladder. Faced with overwhelming odds and legitimate law enforcement, they threw down their weapons and raised their hands. But Wade wasn't finished. With the desperate fury of a cornered animal, he swung his pistol toward Sarah, finger tightening on the trigger. Thomas moved without thinking, stepping between Sarah and the gun just as it fired. The bullet took him high in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. Sarah screamed his name as Pete put Wade down with a single shot that ended the threat forever. Thomas woke 3 days later in his own bed, with Sarah sitting beside him, reading from a book of poetry that had belonged to Mary. The late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window turned her hair to gold, and for a confused moment he thought he might be dreaming. "You're awake," she said softly, setting the book aside. "How do you feel?" "Like I got kicked by a horse." Thomas tried to sit up and immediately thought better of it as pain lanced through his chest. "How bad?" "Bad enough. The bullet missed your heart by inches, but it cracked a rib and tore up some muscle. Doc Morrison says you'll heal, but it's going to take time." Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You almost died, Thomas. You almost died saving me." "Worth it," he said simply. Sarah shook her head, but she was smiling through her tears. "You impossible man. What am I supposed to do with you?" "Marry me," Thomas said without thinking, then looked surprised at his own words. "I mean, that is, if you'd want to... Hell, I'm making a mess of this." Sarah leaned down and kissed him gently, carefully, mindful of his injuries. When she pulled back, her green eyes were shining. "Yes," she said simply. "Though you might have picked a better time to propose." "Seemed like the right moment to me." They were married a month later in a simple ceremony on the ranch, with Pete Garrison standing as Thomas's best man and Doc Morrison's wife serving as Sarah's matron of honor. Half the territory showed up, drawn by curiosity, and stayed by the obvious love between the couple. Jake Morrison, who'd proven himself a man in the fight, read from the Bible with a voice that only shook slightly. When it came time for the vows, Thomas and Sarah spoke words they'd written themselves, promising not just to love and honor each other, but to face whatever storms might come together, without fear. As they kissed to seal their union, the crowd cheered and someone fired off a celebratory shot. Sarah laughed, the sound bright as silver bells, and Thomas thought Mary would have approved of the joy that filled the air. The years that followed weren't easy, the West never was, but they were good. Thomas and Sarah built their life together one day at a time, weathering droughts and hard winters, celebrating good harvests and the gradual growth of their herd. Sarah proved herself a natural rancher with an intuitive understanding of both land and animals that impressed even the most skeptical neighbors. They never had children of their own, but like Nary before her, Sarah had a gift for caring for other people's young ones. The ranch became a refuge for anyone who needed it, children whose parents had died, families facing hard times, even the occasional drifter who just needed a meal and a safe place to sleep. Sarah planted Mary's orchard in the spring of their second year together, apple and cherry trees that she tended with loving care. When they finally bore fruit, she made pies that became legendary throughout the territory, and the sight of children playing beneath the blossoming branches fulfilled a dream that had waited years to come true. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains, talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes Sarah would speak of Running Wolf, keeping his memory alive with stories of their time together. Thomas never felt jealous of her first love. He understood that the heart was big enough to hold multiple truths, and that Sarah's ability to love deeply was part of what made her who she was. In return, he shared memories of Mary, and Sarah learned to love the woman she'd never met through the tenderness in her husband's voice when he spoke of her. She kept Mary's sewing basket beside the rocking chair, and sometimes in the evenings she would work on the quilt Mary had started, adding her own stitches to create something new from something left unfinished. 5 years after their wedding, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Greyhawk, Running Wolf's brother, arrived at the ranch on a crisp autumn morning, accompanied by 2 other Apache men. Thomas watched from the porch as Sarah ran to embrace them, tears streaming down her face. Greyhawk had aged in the years since his brother's death, but his eyes still held warmth when he looked at Sarah. Through halting English and Sarah's rusty Apache, he told them that Running Wolf's people had never forgotten her, had never blamed her for what happened. They considered her family still, and always would. The visit lasted 3 days, during which Greyhawk shared stories of his brother and accepted Sarah's account of how she had tried to honor Running Wolf's memory. When it came time for them to leave, he pressed a small leather pouch into Sarah's hands. Inside were Running Wolf's medicine beads, the ones his mother had given him before she died. Sarah had worn them during their time together, but they'd been lost when the bounty hunters captured her. Somehow Greyhawk had recovered them from the men who'd killed his brother. "He would want you to have them," Greyhawk said in careful English. "He would want you to be happy." That night, as Sarah sat by the fire, holding the precious beads, Thomas found her crying quietly. But when he asked if she was sad, she shook her head. "I'm grateful," she said. "Grateful for all the love I've been given in this life. From Running Wolf, from you, from people like Greyhawk who could forgive when they had every right to hate. I used to think love was rare in this world, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe it's everywhere, if we just have the courage to see it." Thomas sat beside her and pulled her close, careful not to disturb the beads she held so reverently. "Mary used to say something like that. Said love was like water. It found a way to flow even through the hardest ground. Wise women, both of them. I wish I could have thanked them. You do, every day, by living the kind of life that proves their faith was well placed." As the fire burned low and the stars came out over the Colorado mountains, Thomas and Sarah sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but united in their gratitude for the unexpected gift of finding love twice in one lifetime. Outside, the wind whispered through Mary's orchard, where the apple trees Sarah had planted were heavy with fruit that would feed hungry travelers throughout the long winter ahead. And in the barn, the words "Apache lover" had long since been painted over, replaced with Sarah's careful script with a simple message: "All welcome here." It was exactly the kind of legacy Thomas thought Mary would have wanted. A home built on love instead of hatred, welcome instead of suspicion, hope instead of fear. Sarah had helped him create something worth building, worth protecting, worth passing on to whatever children might find their way to this small sanctuary in the wilderness. The world beyond their ranch was still hard and often cruel, still full of people who let fear poison their hearts against anything different or strange. But here, in this place they'd built together with their own hands and hearts, love had won. And that, perhaps, was a miracle enough for any one lifetime. In years to come, travelers passing through the territory would tell stories about the ranch where the lonely widower and the outcast woman had found each other, where love had triumphed over hatred and hope had grown where despair had once taken root. Some would say it was just a story, too good to be true in such a harsh world. But those who knew where to look could still find the proof, written in the flourishing orchard and the generous table, in the children's laughter that echoed through rooms once marked by silence, and in the quiet contentment of two people who'd learned that sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply refusing to let hatred have the final word. Thomas and Sarah Whitman lived long and loved deeply, and when their time came, they were buried side by side in a small cemetery overlooking the valley they'd called home. Their graves were marked with simple stones that bore no mention of the trauma that had brought them together, only the dates that framed a life lived in service to love. And every spring without fail, wildflowers bloomed around their resting place, flowers no one had planted, growing wild and free in the mountain soil, as if the earth itself remembered the love that had once flourished there and wanted to honor it in the only way it knew. Thank you for joining me on another journey through the forgotten corners of the American West, where love still dared to bloom in the harshest ground. If this story of Thomas and Sarah moved you, if it reminded you that choosing kindness over fear can change everything, then hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because here at Tony Tells Tales, we believe every heart deserves a story, every love leaves a trail. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply choose to stay when the world tells you to run. What story should we uncover next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below, and remember, in a world full of noise, sometimes the quietest voices tell the strongest tales. Until next time, keep listening for the stories that matter. This is Tony, and these are the tales that refuse to be forgotten.